Hi, Megan here from Ninuska Homestead and the blog ninuskamaid.com. This morning I am ready to bake with my sourdough starter. So the first step of baking is I have to discard a portion of the starter, which can feel very wasteful if I don't have some ideas in mind for different things that I can do with the starter. So things that can be done with a discarded sourdough starter are feeding it to your livestock, chicken, pigs, things like that. You can make several different recipes using it. You can compost it. There's all kinds of things that you can do with your sourdough starter discard, but today we're gonna make a simple coffee cake. This is kind of a dual purpose recipe that I really love because not only am I using up my sourdough starter discard, but I am also seasoning my cast iron skillet, which can be very handy. We had some cheeseburgers last night, and sometimes when you cook lean meats in a cast iron skillet, it can cause like a filmy, crusty, blackened area on the skillet. So what we're gonna do today is we're going to preheat the skillet from last night, scrape off any of the residue or anything like that, and then I'm gonna add butter. And the butter is going to do two things. It's going to make this coffee cake extra delicious. It's going to fry it like a donut basically, but it's also going to season my cast iron skillet and kind of rehab it a little bit because we were kind of rough on it. So come along with me and I'm gonna show you how to do this, and it's really easy and really fun. My sourdough starter has been resting in the refrigerator for about 3 days. I put it in there after a feeding in the middle of last week. I let it set at room temperature for about 30 minutes to warm up because if you've ever worked with a sourdough starter, they can be really difficult to stir when they're very cold. Here I'm using a kitchen scale to weigh out 200 grams of sourdough starter for this recipe. Like I mentioned, my sourdough starter today is hungry, meaning it hasn't been fed for several days, but it would be fine if it was a recently fed starter. It would just be a little bit more bubbly and active. To this, I'm adding 2 tablespoons of butter. It's really important that the butter be softened or at room temperature or even melted because it's really tricky to stir it into this recipe. Next, I'm adding in 1 heaping tablespoon of baking powder. Baking powder is the magic ingredient that's going to turn this flat and sad sourdough starter into a fluffy, light, cake-like batter. Air bubbles are going to form almost immediately as the baking powder mixes with the flour and starter to puff up. Here I'm adding 2 tablespoons of sugar. I really like my coffee cakes to be just a little bit sweet. If you like it to be very sweet, go ahead and add more. If you don't need a lot of sugar, add a little bit less. Next up is 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. I go ahead and stir in 1 teaspoon of cinnamon to the batter, but then I reserve the extra teaspoon to sprinkle on top in my faux streusel topping. A pinch of sea salt, and this is ready to rest while I heat up my cast iron skillet. If you actually measure your salt, it's about 1/4 of a teaspoon. One of the bonus parts of this recipe is that it's a great way to re-season a cast iron skillet that needs a little bit of love. So we had cooked some lean meat hamburgers last night, and my skillet was looking a little bit dry and had a little bit of a black film on it. I went ahead and scraped that off after I preheated it, and now I'm letting the butter, the 2 tablespoons of butter, just melt. As this melts, it's going to brown, just like the brown butter in several of my cookie recipes, which gives it kind of a nuttier, richer flavor. As the butter melts, I swirl it around and I swirl it up along the sides of the pan. This is going to create a nonstick texture, plus it's going to make my coffee cake have that crusty, crispy, donut-like fried texture, which is so good. Once I begin to see the little teeny tiny brown flecks floating in the butter, I know that my brown butter is ready. I'm going to add my coffee cake batter kind of gradually. I don't want it to be too thick in the middle. I want it to kind of spread out, and it is a dense batter, which can make this kind of tricky. But at the same time, I don't want to mix it with the butter because I want the butter to stay separate, because that's what's going to create that really good fried crust. This coffee cake is similar to a pancake in that I want it to basically get a nice sear along the edges and the bottom, but I want the top and the middle to stay kind of doughy because we're going to finish off baking it in the oven. So now I'm adding the streusel topping, which is the oatmeal, the brown sugar, and the remaining cinnamon. I'm just kind of sprinkling it everywhere, getting some along the edges too. And we're going to pop it in the oven and finish baking it for about 10 minutes at 400 degrees. As the coffee cake bakes, I'm going to take this time to go ahead and feed my sourdough starter that I borrowed the 200 grams of discard from. To my starter, I'm going to add 1 cup of all-purpose flour and 1/2 cup of filtered water. I'm going to give it a really good stir, and then I'm going to set it on my counter, and hopefully it will spring back to life and get really high and bubbly, and I can make a loaf of bread with it later today. If I wasn't going to cook with it, I would put it back in the refrigerator after feeding, and I could store it realistically a week, possibly even longer. I mean, I've done longer, but technically it's not the right thing to do. I have a few extra kiddos in my kitchen to feed this morning, so I fried up some bacon and a little bit of sausage, and I'm going to serve it with my coffee cake. To serve the coffee cake, I recommend taking it out of the pan and cutting it with a pizza cutter, and then I like to sprinkle it with powdered sugar and add a drizzle of maple syrup. Can we just take a second to appreciate the texture of this coffee cake? It has a crumbly streusel topping. The sides and the bottom are crispy and have a really nice crust to them, and then this inside is just so soft and light and airy. All right, guys. Thanks for joining me in the kitchen this morning. I hope that you like this recipe. Be sure to check out my blog, nenaskahmade.com, for more recipes using sourdough, sourdough starter discard, or just good old-fashioned homestead recipes. Be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, or follow me on Instagram at nenaskahhomestead. Have a wonderful day.